Welcome to New Testament Greek Exegesis 1, Lesson 14, Word Study. Now, it's important to remember in word study that context is king in determining the meaning of words. For example, me agapate tan kosmon, do not love the world. Hutas gar agapisen hatheas tan kosmon, for God so loved the world. How come God can love the world, but we can't? So something is going on here with either the word agapao or with cosmos, or maybe with both. So you have to look at the context. In one, loving the world is a bad thing. In the other, loving the world is a good thing. So is there a difference in the love between our love for the world and God's love for the world? Or is world being used in a different sense, or at least in a different nuance? So context is going to determine what the meaning of the word is. So pay very close attention to the context and not simply to impose what you've learned from your tools onto that context. A good thing to do is to compare translations. So medes, sutes, neatitas, kataphroneto. So let no one despise your youth, New King James Version. For your youth, English Standard Version. Your youthfulness, the NASB, or because you are young, the NIV. So sometimes looking at the various ways that English translations have kind of had to struggle with and come up with a conclusion and translate certain words will give you an idea of what are some of the acceptable expressions in English that can render that word in a way that is consistent with its meaning and makes sense in an English context. So comparing translations, make sure you use multiple translations. And also teach your people to use multiple translations, not just to rely upon a single translation. And be very, very careful not to criticize translations from the pulpit or even in conversation. Be very careful and say, well, the NIV is wrong here, because that will diminish people's confidence in their translations. Rather say, look at the NIV chooses to translate it this way, whereas the ESV chooses to translate it this way. And here's the reasons why. And here's why I think the ESV is done better than the NIV. And that will give them confidence in their translations, rather than if you criticize the translation for being wrong or for being stupid. So be very careful how you handle word translations, especially if you're going to adopt a translation or that is different from the ones that your congregation is used to. Now, some principles for word study is, number one, do not make a word mean more than is intended. So the least meaning is the best meaning. In other words, don't try to import too much meaning into a word. Make a word mean more than it really does. Carson talks about illegitimate totality transfer. I think James Barr is the one who coined that phrase. And he says, ascribing the totality of what the word could mean in each individual instance. So, for example, the word cosmos, do not love the world, could mean adornment, could be order, could be the world, the universe, the sum total of all beings above the level of animals, the planet Earth, humanity, the system of human existence in its many aspects. But it can't mean all of that in do not love the world. I mean, do not love adornment and order and the universe. And no, you have to be careful not to transfer all of that meaning into your verse. And sometimes maybe you've heard a sermon where a pastor has done that. So try not to make the word mean more than is intended. Don't try to transfer the totality of its possible meanings into your single sentence. and try to make it say something it doesn't. Second, prioritize synchrony over diachrony. So a syncretic study of a word means that you study the word within the same time period. So we're studying the New Testament. So how is this word used in other New Testament books? How is it used in intertestamental literature? How is it used even in the LXX, the Septuagint? How is it used by maybe some of the early church fathers within the first couple of centuries of the church? So you want to understand how that word is used basically from about 300 BC to about 300 AD. A diachronic study of the word is tracing a word's meaning throughout time. And that can be helpful, and you can see how the word has changed in its meaning. And you can say, hey, look, in this text, the word means this, even though 400 years ago it was used to mean this. And then 600 years later, it evolved and started meaning this, but in our text. And you can see how maybe some of those meanings are related. But diachronic study, you have to be very, very careful that you don't say, well, because it meant this in 500 BC, it must mean this in AD 50. Probably not true. For example, James 2:3, epiblepsite de epiton ferunta ten esthetai ten lampron, and ye have respect to him that weareth the gay clothing. Well, what does the word gay clothing mean? We want to know what it meant when the King James Version was translated. So the 1600s, what does the word gay mean in the 1600s? Not what does it mean today. Don't read the meaning of the word today back into the 1600s. You will have a problem. So another fallacy you have to be aware of is the etymological fallacy, that the belief that the origin of a word, its etymology, reveals a deeper or truer sense of its meaning. And sometimes you'll hear a pastor go, well, the word means this. If you take it apart, it means this or that, such as butterfly, right? It means butter flying through the air. No, it actually comes from flutterby, butterfly. So it actually changed its pronunciation because it's hard to say flutterby. It actually became butterfly. But knowing that, does that really help me understand what a butterfly is? Probably not. So you can have an etymological fallacy where people say, well, because it is epi-ousion means this. Well, etymology becomes helpful when maybe studying names. What does the name mean? How is that name being used? Does it have some kind of use in the context where the name's meaning is significant for the context? Especially when you're studying, especially the book of Genesis, names are very, very important. And names have very significance not only to the meaning of the person's name or the place, but also to what is going on in that section of the story. Etymology might be helpful also for rare words. If a word occurs only once or twice in the New Testament, its etymology may be helpful. For example, in Matthew 6:11, epousion, daily. Give us today our daily bread. And epousion has probably been coined by the apostles themselves, so it may be difficult to find out what the word means. But if you look in meaning one, it's derived from epi plus ousia, so things that are necessary for existence. Others would say, well, no, it comes from the substantiving of epi plus tein ouson chimeron for the current day or today. Others will say, no, it's coming from he epusa, hemera, the following day. And others say, well, no, it's derived from epienai, to becoming, and therefore it's an analogy of epion, the future, so bread for the future. So etymology may help us understand that word, may give us some clues to what its possible meaning might be. But normally etymology is not going to help you understand what a word means. So be very careful not to commit the etymology fallacy. Number 3, the third principle for word study, is do not confuse the word with the concept. For example, proseuchomai. If you're going to do a study of prayer, you can't simply look at the use of proseuchomai in the New Testament or its use in the LXX and other literature, because there's also such words as deesis, euchomai, and there's also places where prayer is talked about where the prayer words aren't used. So the concept is much larger than one single word. So you can't simply do a word study of one word if you're going to study a concept. The fourth principle is do not view word study tools as inerrant. You cannot say, well, BDAG says this, therefore it must be true, or Louw-Nida says it means this, therefore it must mean that. Lexicons and word study tools are made by humans, and they are not inerrant. They do have mistakes. For example, in 1 John 2:2, it says, kai autos hilasmos estin periton hamartion hemon. Well, the meaning of the word hilasmos, you'll find in some lexicons argue against the reading of propitiation, and they'll argue for expiation, the cleansing of a sin, rather than the propitiation of a sin, simply because they don't think God can have any kind of wrath. He makes God look like he's capricious. He's just being capriciously wrathful like the other Greek gods, and therefore they don't want to use propitiation. But really, propitiation is the best meaning of that term, because Christ propitiates God's wrath by expiating the sin, by removing the sin. Now, there are some good resources for word study. You probably need to have BDAG. It's pretty hard to survive without Bauer, Danker, Art, and Gingrich. You need to have that. I know it's like $140 for the hardback copy, and also about $140 for the electronic copy. Just for so you know, for me, I bought BDAG like 30 years ago, and once I bought Accordance and got BDAG on Accordance, I never touched my physical copy of BDAG again. So it's personal preference whether you like to have the physical book. There are things that are easier to do with the physical book than there are with electronic resource, but electronic resources, I think, are much more portable and much more versatile, and you can search them and you can do things with them that are much more difficult or impossible with a physical copy. The NIDNTT is very helpful, and also the EDNT, Exegetical Dictionary of New Testament Theology. That's pretty new. That's very good. And New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology. Very, very helpful. And then also Louw-Nida. A lot of people don't know about Louw-Nida. It's not complete, but they organize the words according to semantic domain, and that becomes very, very helpful when you start doing discourse analysis and start maybe doing word study. So you see not only the one prayer word, but you see all of the words for prayer together under one heading. So Louw-Nida is a very, very helpful resource, and these are almost necessary to have, at least BDAG and possibly Louw-Nida. But NIDNTT has been very helpful for me. I do not have EDNT, but that's something I probably need to get. There's also other sources such as Kittle or the Theological Dictionary of New Testament Theology. It's a little more liberal, but it is very extensive. It's 10 volumes. Has a lot of diachronic studies and etymologies and things like that. But it also does help pick up the use in the LXX and New Intertestamental literature, and also the early church fathers. So it's very, very helpful. But just be aware that it is very liberal in its leaning. There's Liddell, Scott, and Jones, Liddell and Scott. So intermediate lexicon. Very helpful for if you're doing anything with the Septuagint, because it does cover most Hellenistic and also older Greek word terms. Moulton and Billigan brings a lot of the more recent studies that are found, especially the papyri, and also the new docs of the Judean desert is even more up to date in bringing all the hundreds and hundreds of, or actually thousands and thousands of papyri that have been found in Egypt and other places that shed light on the use of words within 300 BC to 300 AD as well. And there's also the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, very helpful tool if you want to study the use of words in all of the Greek literature, classical Greek literature. Very, very helpful tool, but kind of limited in its search engine, but it will help you find words that these other resources will not find for you. Now, some strategies for word study. First of all, consider the immediate context and the broader context. Remember, context is king. So be on your guard so that your minds are not dulled from carousing from krypale, drunkenness and worries of life, or that day will come on you unexpectedly. Well, what does krypale mean? Well, it seems to be associated with drunkenness and worries of life. It seems that something's going to dull your mind. So carousing, what it's got to fit into that context. And what else is going on in Luke 21 at the end times? What is it that we're not supposed to be doing that will enable us to be ready for the coming of Christ? So then you might want to compare some English translations. Surfeiting, dissipation, debauchery, carousing, wasteful living, drinking parties. You might need to look up some of those in an English dictionary to know exactly how those are being used. And then third, you want to consider the same biblical author's use of that word before you consider other biblical authors' use of the word. So if Paul is using the word, or here Luke uses the word, well, does he use the word also in Acts? If Paul uses a word, where does Paul use that word in his other letters? If John uses the word, does he use it in his gospel, his 3 letters, or in the Apocalypse? So you want to consider that first before you consider other biblical authors' use, because you're more likely to get maybe some idiosyncratic uses of that word than maybe some other author might use it differently. So Paul might use a word one way, or another author might use it a different way. You don't want to read Peter's use of a word into Paul. You want to make sure that you understand how Paul uses that word first, and then maybe compare and contrast how Peter or John or Luke or someone else uses it. Number 4, consult lexicons or word study tools that we've been talking about. Can study your tools. So BDAG says, both carousing, intoxication, and its result, drunken headache, hangover, are associated with the term, since it means dizziness, staggering, when the head refuses to function. So unbridled indulgence in a drinking party or drinking bout will definitely cause dizziness and staggering and other unpleasant side effects and sinful behavior. New International Dictionary, New Testament Theology says intoxication occurs in a few Hellenistic sources and can also be used of the effects of intoxication, dizziness and staggering. In the New Testament, it occurs only once, and in conjunction with methe, the effect of drunkenness is probably intended, thus dissipation in the RSV. Exegetical Dictionary, New Testament Theology, the New Testament, intoxication, dizziness, or staggering. Loanida, say drunken behavior, which is completely without moral restraint. In a number of languages, it may be possible to translate krypale as bad things people do when they are very drunk. Very helpful for a sermon, maybe there. You can also consult other works such as the Baylor Handbook, says drunken behavior, which is completely without moral restraint. Or Bach, in his commentary, says dizziness or carousing associated with drunkenness. And then 5, you want to identify other words in the same semantic domain. And here's where lo and nida can come very handy. So you have methu and methe, to become drunk on alcoholic beverages or drunkenness. Oinophalugia, drunkenness implying the consumption of large quantities of wine. And meluskamai, to become intoxicated. So these words are related and can help you distinguish our word from other words within that same semantic domain. It might help you then to compare and contrast and to maybe more tightly limit the meaning of the word. We also have komos and tapos, methuzos and oinapates and paroinas will help you then to distinguish that word. And then also consider number 6, the use of the word in the New Testament and then also the Septuagint and other intertestamental literatures. So here we have Hermas, his mandate 6.2.5. When some angry temperamental outburst or bitterness comes over you, recognize that the angel of wickedness is in you. Then comes the desire for much busyness and extravagant kinds of food and drink and much drunkenness and various kinds of unnecessary luxuries and the desire for women and greed and arrogance and pretentiousness and whatever else resembles or is similar to these things. So whenever these things enter your heart, you know that an angel of wickedness is within you. So Palon is much drunkenness or much dizziness, many drinking parties. Here we have extravagant kinds of food and drink. And then we have maybe drinking parties where much drunkenness takes place. And then you want to end by stating clearly and succinctly what you've discovered. So you've done your work, and now you want to write down what that word means and how it's applicable to your context. So it refers not just to drunkenness in the abstract, but visible immoral behavior that often accompanies the clouded faculties of an inebriated person. The ancient texts above present such immoral behavior in relation to other persons, that is, the way a drunk person sins against others through foolish talk, violence, and sexual exploitation.